Thanks, David, and thanks for inviting me along to do this talk for you today. So the work that I'm going to describe today takes a numerical modelling approach, and that's some work that I really focused on during my postdoc over in Germany at the University of Tübingen. And there I was working with this team of microstructural modellers, the AL team over there, when I was on an Alexander von Humboldt Foundation Fellowship. But now I'm back here at Monash University in Clayton, and sort of continuing on with that our numerical modelling work. But really the main driver for this work was my work prior to this in ductile shear zones, so naturally deformed rocks. So I worked in a number of ductile shear zones, and on screen now I have a thin section from one of those ductile shear zones. This is from the Zanskar shear zone in the northwest Himalaya. And so you can see that we have sort of two main areas in this thin section. So this is a cross-polarized light image down a microscope, and it's about 2 millimeters across in this direction. So there's two main regions here, and there's this area down here which is dominated by really fine-grained biotite and muscovite, which has the pink and the green birefringence colours, and then this area up here which is mainly just quartz and feldspar. So you can see that they're behaving quite differently in response to deformation, and that's because they're very different strengths. So if we zoom out and have a look at the rock that this thin section came from, it looks like this. So you can see that we have these, this compositional difference here. So there's light leucocratic layers in there and these darker mica-rich layers here. And there are a number of shear planes in this rock. So this rock's being ductily sheared. This is an orthogneiss. So we have C planes, which are roughly in this orientation, S planes, which step up in that orientation, and then we have these C prime shear bands, which are these big, shear bands that cross-cut through there. So if we zoom in again on the thin section, which sort of, goes over this compositional layering, you can see those shear planes in these two different layers as well. So in the bottom section, you can see these C planes, which are this sort of orientation and parallel to the shear zone boundary. Then we have S planes, which dip in this orientation in the opposite direction to shear. So the shear sense shown here is a dextral shear sense. So we have S planes dip like this. And these microfish here, these muscovite fish, have their long axes parallel to S and the tops are parallel to C, so they're deformed on that SC fabric. And then we have these C prime planes that are these planes that dip in this orientation in the direction of shearing. And if I take away those lines for a moment, and you can have a look at those without them, so you can see that they're defined by these layers of biotite. So the dark brown is biotite. And so it's the biotite, which is the weakest mineral in this rock, that's defining those C prime shear bands. C prime shear bands are also called extensional crenulation cleavage in the literature. So if you've read about those and we're on the same page, we're talking about focusing on those mainly today, and also how this sort of SC fabric develops in these models. So in comparison to this bottom layer here, which is deforming quite ductily and showing these ductile shear planes, the top half is this quartzo-feldspathic rock, and that shows quite a different sort of deformation. So here in black we have a feldspar porphyroclast that has this first order birefringence, and that has been fractured apart. So there's a piece here, a piece there, a piece here, and then a piece sort of in here. So that feldspar porphyroclast has been fractured apart, and then those brittle pieces have been sort of rotated and sheared. In contrast to that, the quartz down here shows recrystallization. So minerals deform differently based on their strengths. Okay, moving forward. Okay, so we understand fairly well how SC fabric forms, so how these sorts of structures form. So if you start off with a shear zone, you have a shear zone boundary, and just say it's undergoing dextral shear, then the first thing that happens is that minerals align to the S-plane. So this nucleates at an angle of about 45 degrees from the shear zone boundary. And as finite strain increases and shearing continues, the S-planes slowly rotate into parallelism with the C-plane or with the shear zone boundary, until eventually S-planes have become C-planes, and these are parallel to the shear zone boundary. And all the time we can have new S-planes nucleating elsewhere while this rotation is occurring. So that's sort of a simplified view of how these SC planes develop. So that leaves us with sort of a fabric that looks like this. Is anastomosing kind of, planes, SC fabric. So yeah, we do understand that fairly well, but these C prime shear bands, there's still a lot to be understood about those. And there's multiple ideas of how they form and why they form. So I'll have a look at some of those today, and then suggest some alternatives as well. So the work that I'm going to tell you about today, I've reported in this paper, and you can get that on ResearchGate, or you can email Michelle and she can provide a copy of that as well, or you can email me and I can also send that to you. And all the movies that I'll show you are available on YouTube. If you Google that, I'll come up, and they're also available on the Elle YouTube. So first, let's have a look at the work that's been done before. So previous research on naturally deformed rocks has suggested that these C prime shear bands form or nucleate on the plane of maximum shear strain rate. They're thought to be due to flow parallel to the shortening eigenvector due to bulk hardening or general shear. So not just simple shear, but also pure shear, a component of pure shear is thought to be required for these C prime shear bands to develop. They're thought to form during the last stage of shear zone activity, and that's because they usually cross-cut other features. So you can see this is a C prime shear band in here, and it's cross-cutting this S fabric through here. You can see that, as I pointed out in the thin section from the Zanskar shear zone, that they're also defined by biotite in these rocks as well. Biotite and quartz up here. So defined by the weakest phase in the rock, which in this case is biotite. Experimental studies have taken the approach where they've gotten a rock that looks like this. So this is a quartzite in thin section, this in cross-polarized light. This is a quartz feldspar mica rock. So those whitish grains are micas. And so they put these into an apparatus and deform it, and they end up with something that looks like this. So by controlling the temperature and pressure of the experiment, they're able to simulate different strength ratios between the different minerals. So they're able to make, the strengths of mica, quartz and feldspar, different to each other on that basis. And so they end up with something like this, where you can see we've got these C prime shear bands, particularly, forming within the layer of biotite there, biotite and quartz. And these studies have found that C prime shear bands form when the strength ratio between minerals is at least 3 to 5. So the weakest mineral, the biotite in this case, is at least 3 times weaker than quartz in this model. The proportion of weak phase required for these C prime shear bands to nucleate is thought to be about 20%, at least 20%. So it seems like those two factors, the strength contrast between phases or between minerals and the proportion of weak phase, are both really important for the nucleation of C prime shear bands. So I decided to focus on those two variables and manipulate those to see how, when and why C prime shear bands form. So I used the numerical modelling platform Elle, and you can find out more about Elle at this website here. And the idea with Elle is that you start with a starting microstructure. And here I have 3 different minerals that are these different grains, so in the 3 different colours. And in Elle talk, we call these grains flins. And flins are made up of or defined by these boundary nodes that form double or triple junctions, and these are connected by straight boundary segments. And then in the background, we have this grid of U nodes or unconnected nodes. And these U nodes are where the magic happens. So they store information about strain rate and stress and the orientation of the crystal lattice at every point. So these are really important for how L works and the information that we can get out of L. So the idea with simple shear in L is that we set the amount of shear strain for each step. So in my model, they used a gamma change of 0.02. So we deform the model one step, and then the bit that leaves the bounding box on this side is repositioned back over here. So we have these wrapping boundaries where stuff disappears on one side and reappears on the other side. So that's pretty handy. We simulate the deformation using full field viscoplastic deformation code. So that's different from some other L studies. It's relatively new, and you can read more about that in the paper if you're interested in exactly how we do that. So the deformation in L is accommodated by dislocation glide on crystallographic slip systems. So in all the minerals in here, they all have these, in this thin section, they all have different slip systems. So for instance, as illustrated here, the green one, the red one, the blue one. And so each of these have different strengths or different resistances to the shear. And we call this the critical resolved shear stress. And so in L, I can set those different slip systems to have different strengths. And the beauty of that is that I'm able to simulate the anisotropy in biotite, for example, by manipulating the strength of the different slip systems. So we're actually able to do a reasonable job of simulating the most important aspects of some key minerals. So that's awesome. So I used 3 different minerals. So in grey was a strong phase, like this strong feldspar over here. In white, I had the intermediate strength phase, which is like quartz. And in black, I had the weak phase, which is like this weak biotite through here. I ended up with 12 different conditions in a 3x4 design. So I had 3 different levels of the variable of the phase strength contrast. So low, medium, and high. So in the low phase strength contrast condition, the intermediate strength phase was 1.5 times the strength of the weak phase. In medium, it was 2.5 times, and in high, it was 4 times. And in all of the conditions, the strong phase was double the strength of the intermediate strength phase. The basal plane in all of the models, the basal plane of the weak phase was 10 times the strength, or 10 times as weak as the non-basal planes. So that's how we simulated that anisotropy of mica there. Then there were 4 different conditions or 4 different levels of proportion of weak phase. So 5, 15, 30, and 45% weak phase. So giving those 12 conditions there. So I simulated dextral simple shear in 900 steps for each condition. And each step involved a strain of 0.02, a gamma of 0.02. And so the finite strain built up over time. So step 2, the finite strain was 0.04, and so on. And the model slowly deformed over time, so that by step 18 it had a gamma of 0.36, and by step 900 it had a gamma of 18. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to show you some of the results. I'm going to show you 4 different conditions of the 12. And they're all going to look like this same setup. So up here, I'll tell you the proportion of weak phase. Here, I'll tell you the phase strength contrast condition, and this will tell you what that means. So the intermediate strength phase is 4 times the strength of the weak phase. The strong phase is 8 times the strength of the weak phase. On this side, we have the strain rate. High is red, low is blue. On this side, we have the microstructure with the weak phase in black, strong phase in grey, and the intermediate strength phase in white. So I'll talk you through the 4 different models, and they're all available on YouTube if you want to watch them again. Okay, so off we go. Oh, that seems to have, let me try that again. Da, da, da. seems to have not started at the start, so I'll just restart that. Maybe if I go up, I might just try because it is important to get them on the same time. Sorry. Okay, there we are. Okay, so the first thing that happens in these models is that the grains align to the orientation of the S-plane, so an angle of 45 degrees from the shear zone boundary. And then the weak phase quickly rotates over into parallelism with the C-plane and with the shear zone boundary. Layers of weak phase that are oriented parallel to the C-plane partition most of the strain. So we get these really high strain rates in those layers of weak phase that are parallel to the C-plane. The layers of weak phase get longer as different layers join up. And that happens because there's high stress. So later on I'll show you some of the stress data, and there's high stress at areas, at the tips of these layers of weak phase that are accommodating such high strain rates. And that high stress allows these layers, these individual layers, to link up into these through-going shear planes of weak phase. And those really partition a lot of the strain rate. C prime shear bands you can see in this orientation, so that's one through there. Another thing that happens is that because these shear planes localize such a high strain rate, sometimes the layers on either side, which are more competent, which are stronger, need to fold in order to accommodate that sort of deformation. So you can see that forming here. So we have an asymmetric fold forming in the strong phase on the above that layer of weak phase, just because the strain rate's so high in here. So it's a mechanical consequence of shearing in this model and the distribution of strain rate. If you like asymmetric folds, you should watch this one because it does something cool. It shears apart and forms these rootless isoclinal folds that we see everywhere, Bermagui, everywhere. So here's a C prime shear band, and that's rotated backwards. So the way that these C prime shear bands form is that they're normal C planes that rotate forwards, and then sometimes they rotate backwards. So they have two different fates. One is that they rotate backwards and in just parallelism with the C plane, and then there's another fate as well, which I'll show you when it comes up. So at the end of this, we end up with this. So that fold that I pointed out has sheared apart and formed these two sort of rootless isoclinal folds, which, yeah, are quite common in ductile shear zones everywhere. So it's nice to see those as well. Okay, so now on to 15% weak phase and a medium strength contrast. So the start of this model is quite similar. So the grains align to the S plane, and then the weak phase turns over, rotates into parallelism with the C plane. The locus of maximum strain rate sort of jumps around between these different layers that are all parallel, all layers of weak phase, all parallel to the C plane. And you can see it's, you know, highest here, but then that moves to here and moves to there, just because shearing might become easier in one spot, relatively harder in another spot. So it just sort of localizes to wherever shearing is the easiest, where it's easiest to maintain that high strain rate. In this model, the high proportion of weak phase means that the strong phase doesn't deform as much. The weak phase is able to accommodate more of the deformation. There's a C prime shear band up there. You can see it forms in the layers that are at relatively low strain rate, so not at high strain rate. They're really, you know, low strain rate here, and that's a C prime shear band. High strain rate on either side. So that's an interesting observation that I'll get into later on. So if we keep watching, let's see, you can see lots of asymmetric folds, particularly, you know, around where these interconnected layers of weak phase are. We have one major shear plane through here that is localizing a high proportion, a very high proportion of the strain rate. And you can see that's almost linked up, except it's got this one sort of hard phase bridge is what I call it. So this region that's occupied by this strong and intermediate strength phase is not allowing it to completely link up, but then that moves out the way, and then we end up with this interconnected layer. The C prime shear bands formed there and here. This one is actually shortening, so you can see the layer getting thicker through there and folds forming on either side of that layer. So that's the alternate fate of C prime shear bands, that they thicken and they sort of collapse. So they thicken and shorten, and you know, as well as sort of rotating backwards towards the C orientation. So yeah, okay. So now moving on to 30% weak phase. So you'll notice over here in the strain rate, we have a number of high strain rate bands that are oriented vertically. These are actually antithetic C double prime shear bands, just to add another shear plane into the mix. So I will talk about those more in the next model, but I want to point them out now so you're ready. And they show the opposite sense of shear to C prime shear bands, so C double prime shear bands, and they accommodate rotation in the model. So I'll show you those better in the next one. You can see here that the higher proportion of weak phase in this model allows the strong phase, the grey phase, to maintain its more sort of equant shape, and it forms these more sigmoidally shaped class and elongate lozenges, and forms that nice SC fabric. You can kind of, I mean, if you stare at these things for a long time, as I have, you can kind of pick up that there's some more weak phase up in this area, and there are patches down here that have a bit less weak phase, and that has sort of, you know, interesting implications. So you'll see later on that up here there are lots of small asymmetric folds develop because of all those high strain rate layers of weak phase in there, causing that heterogeneity and causing the strong phase to need to fold in response to that deformation within those weak phase layers. So you can really see those asymmetric folds forming in there. So lots of C prime shear bands in this model as well. So there's one up here, one here that's now rotating backwards into parallelism with the C plane. One through here. So that looks like it's going to shorten. We can watch that one and see what happens to it. So a bit of shortening perhaps, and a bit of slowly sort of rotating backwards into parallelism with the C plane. So if you're watching the strain rate, you'll notice that, you know, it does sort of jump around from between these different layers of weak phase as well. Okay, so now on to 45% weak phase. So here are those vertically oriented C double prime shear bands. The most interesting one is down here. So you can see that that C double prime shear band is accommodating the rotation of that lithon in here of strong and intermediate strength phase. It's really deforming like a competent lithon within that sort of sea of weak phase. So these C double prime shear bands seem to, you know, mainly be related to that vorticity, to that rotation. And we found that in another paper as well by Ran et al. It looked at deformation of conglomerates, so class in a matrix as well, that those C double prime shear bands form as a consequence of that. The high proportion of weak phase in these models means that the distribution of strain rate is much more distributed across all of those different, or many of those different weak phase layers. And there are lots of little C prime shear bands, but they're quite ephemeral. So they come and go quite quickly. There's one here, and that's shortening and collapsing, it looks like. There's an antithetic C double prime shear band in through there. This is a C prime shear band through here I'm not sure what's happening with that one. There's a C prime through there. So the rotation in this model is a lot quicker than in the other models because everything's sort of moving a lot more because the strain rate is really distributed. So while there's sort of a lot of C double prime shear bands, they rotate backwards and they collapse and shorten much quicker than in the other models. So we do, when there's such a high proportion of weak phase, it forms more of an anastomosing, shear zone network as well. We do still see the development of these through-going shear planes that are comprised of almost a continuous layer weak phase, but they take a longer time to develop, you know, because there's, you know, the stresses, I guess, are less when there's so much weak phase. So the stress is more distributed. Okay, so they're the four models that I wanted to show you to give you a sense of the results. So there are two main reasons that C prime shear bands form in these rocks. So the first one is what I call when there's high stress in a hard phase bridge. So when we have a layer of weak phase that is almost continuous through the models, almost a through-going shear plane, it just has these small little areas in here that are occupied by harder phases. So, and those areas are at really high stress. So this is stress in this column that I'm going to show you down here. This is strain rate, and this is just the grain microstructure. So these areas are at high stress, and what that means is that areas within the model need to shorten to accommodate, you know, that high stress and to accommodate the high strain rate in these weak phase layers. So here you can see that we've got the development of asymmetric fold above this weak phase layer as a result of, you know, shortening because of that high strain rate in that weak phase layer. And that shortening causes this area up here to rotate forwards. So this layer of weak phase here rotates forwards in response to sort of shortening down here. So it's at a low strain rate. These are low strain rate planes, and yeah, it rotates forward as a response, a mechanical response to you know, deformation elsewhere in the model. Once that stress, that higher stress and the shortening sort of has abated in that area, then the shear plane, the C prime shear band, rotates backwards. It rotates backwards into parallelism with the C plane. So that's one way that the C prime shear bands form. The other way is when there's a layer of weak phase that has one region at a higher strain rate than other parts of the shear plane. So for instance, here we've got this layer of weak phase. It's going through like this. This part's at relatively low strain rate. This part's at high strain rate. This part's at low strain rate. You can kind of think of this as moving faster than the other areas. So what that does is sort of causes, in order for a mechanical response of that, is if this part and this part are sort of at high strain rate, is that this part needs to rotate forwards in order to accommodate that. So again, notice that this is at a low strain rate. So C prime shear bands are forming in low strain rate planes or low strain rate regions in response to this high strain rate in other areas. So then when the strain rate abates in those high strain rate regions, when that abates, then this plane rotates back in parallelism with the C plane. So that rotation backwards, that's sort of one of the two ways that C prime shear bands sort of end their lives. Okay, so we found that C prime shear bands form in all of the models we looked at, with one exception, and that was when there's only 5% weak phase and there's a low contrast in strength between the different minerals, then they don't form in that model. But in all of the other 11, they do. They're more common when there's a high phase strength contrast, but they're more ephemeral as well, so they don't last as long. And you can see these C prime shear bands, they're sometimes a bit hard to pick out amongst all of this black and white, but they're here in all of the models. So C prime shear bands have two main fates. One is that they rotate backwards and become C planes, and I pointed that out a few times. And the other is they shorten and collapse, so shorten and collapse. So here's an example of that. We have a C prime shear band there. It shortens internally, and you can really see that quite easily from the folds that form on either side of it. And then that shortened C prime shear band gets sheared apart. So this is sort of a depiction of how that evolves there. And so it forms these sort of X-shaped structures, which we also see in shear zones. So this is kind of a plausible method perhaps for shear zones in natural settings as well. Now, in contrast to the previous work that's been done on C prime shear bands, experimental work and on naturally deformed rocks, we find that C prime shear bands do not nucleate on the plane of maximum shear strain rate. In fact, it's these planes are at low strain rate, They don't require general shear because all of these models were under simple shear, so there was no pure shear component. They do not only form at the last stage of shear zone activity, although I can see where that comes from, because you do need to form those interconnected layers of weak phase in order to get these C prime shear bands to form. So perhaps those are related, but they're not related to the last stages of activity in a shear zone necessarily. And they only require 5% of weak phase to form if there's a moderate phase strength contrast. So unlike previous studies which suggested you need at least 20%, we find that you only need 5% for these to form. But there are some, differences between this study and between, experimental studies and the way that natural rocks deform. So these models are mechanical models. They don't look at recrystallization, they don't look at water. There's a few things that we don't include which may explain some of these differences. Okay, so that's it from me. And if you've got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Great, thanks very much, Melanie. That's a very interesting presentation, and